Buon pomeriggio, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for being here to our following section, our last English-speaking section of today with again, many books and many things to say. Again, many interesting things to say. So moreover, there's a lot of you, which is always nice. First of all, I want to thank the authors that are here today, and some of them who has a more difficult challenge than others, maybe. But that's why you came also to see. So anyway, it is great as usual. So let's start. Let's start with something that is connected to the program and hopefully the movie you watched just today, meaning Ernest Lubitsch. There we go.
Okay. Well, thank you. You know, it's been amusing, and I needed to correct. People will keep on congratulating me on my latest book, on Lubitsch, but I'm not one of the editors. I just merely had an essay in it. But you know, I was very excited by this collection, and they're doing it initially by accident. When they approached me about doing an essay on new approaches to Ernst Lubitsch, Brigitte Peuker, who was my colleague and now retired at Yale in film studies, and Ido Lewitt, who her co-editor, who was a graduate student, and in fact, in a way, her graduate student, which is why, for instance, Brigitte's name goes first. It's not in alphabetical order. You may notice, even though Ido actually has an essay in the collection, while Brigitte shared the introduction. In any case, they approached me about doing something, and I thought, oh, this is a chance to republish one of my essays and they wouldn't have it, and I had to do something new, and you know, I left Lubitsch behind. I mean, you know, I had and then Brigitte Peuker actually suggested that I take a look at Three Women, which, you know, immediately turned out to be this amazing achievement, you know, by Lubitsch, but a gold mine for me. And initially I thought, oh, well, why not? You know, this would be my third essay on Lubitsch, and you know, Three Women. So this is like a neat coincidence, and went from there. But you know, I can return to that, but I have been, and you know, will people confess to this, that you know, you have a collection, an essay in a collection, and you don't necessarily read all the essays in it. And because I'm here representing the book and the editors, I have spent, you know, considerable time going through the other essays, and indeed a lot of the book, and I knew this going in, is a lot of the essays are about silent Lubitsch, both in Germany and during Warner Brothers, and so, you know, it seemed to be really appropriate to present here. Ido, I should say, was going to be here, but he's in the midst of a war in the Middle East. He teaches in Israel, and he just felt he couldn't leave his family, but he really planned to be here. So that was the idea, to find an excuse to bring him here, and for him to be able to enjoy the wonders of the Giornata del Cinema Muto, but not to be this year anyway. So yeah, I don't, you know, I could just point to a few things in the book. You know, there's actually a number of essays about Lubitsch's German period, but the first two essays both really engage this problem of Jewish stereotypes and you know, how to think that through. Comes up in some other essays too, particularly one which sort of foregrounds Thomas Alsasser's take on Lubitsch, which I found interesting, and thinking about the ways in which it was a kind of critique of a certain kind of German bourgeois kind of performance or world. Ido's essay, actually, I thought was quite interesting because, let's see if I can find here. He talks about regulating the gaze and the voice. Well, he talks about two films in particular, The Merry Jail, a film I confess I have not seen, but now I want to see, a film from, the mid-teens or later teens, but from the German period, and then So This Is Paris. And he sort of sees this at one film coming at a time when this, if you will, the classical Hollywood system, even though in Germany, but the classical system of editing and representation, the construction of the visual world is falling into place, and the other just before the coming of sound. So he sort of sees these as two quite interesting moments, and the way in which, on one hand, letters are being used, and the other, radio comes into play. So, Joel McElhenney has something on beds, and in all the different Lubitsch films, which is quite interesting. So some silent films, some sound films, and like the history of the bed in cinema, but in particularly in Lubitsch cinema. So that's quite clever. And for me, the one that I've really actually come to made me rethink what I wrote in my essay is Donna Kornhaber's Chaplain Lubitsch, and just emphasizing the way a woman of Paris had such an impact on Lubitsch, and in particular for her, the marriage circle. But having read that, and as I looked at Three Women, which I've now seen many times, although I have to say I'm really grateful to be able to finally see it on the big screen, where I saw certain things I hadn't seen before. Of course, one of the reasons we see things on the big screen, that actually I really see the way that A Woman in Paris has, continues to be influential in Three Women. So I really actually want to go back and both look at A Woman in Paris and the marriage circle. So it really was very, provocative for me, and I hope these kinds of things might make it provocative for you as well. Really beginning to think about sort of Warner Brothers rather than a series of related but sort of episodic films, really trying to understand Lubitsch's movement through Warner Brothers, which I think is Three Women really sort of is a kind of allegory for, right? That he gets seduced. I mean, I see the Lamont character as basically a stand-in for Jack Warner, who wins him, and there's this discussion. William Paul, for instance, does not think that the blonde women in Lubitsch's films have anything to do with Lubitsch, but I think he actually in Three Women definitely is in the Pauline Frederick character. The mother is basically Lubitsch, who stands for Lubitsch. So Lubitsch basically ends up killing Jack Warner metaphorically, as a quote joke, as Freud might say, because he can't do it in real life. But clearly, Three Women shows you that already the tensions between Lubitsch and the Warner Brothers is actually quite intense. I mean, you sort of hear about it, but like you're always sort of wondering, how is it manifested? So anyway, I think I found her article really interesting and provocative. So I mean, many of you saw Three Women this morning, and what was such a surprise for me as soon as I saw it was realizing, well, the two other Lubitsch films I'd written about were Lady Windermere's Fan, and then a film that's often not considered a Lubitsch film, but I think clearly is. He just didn't direct it. He wrote the script, and he worked. I think he worked quietly with the director of The Jazz Singer. So this was like Lubitsch's Three Women was the first film in which May McVoy appeared. So it really was a May McVoy trilogy, which certainly made sense in retrospect with Three Women and his obsession with threes in a wide variety of ways. Ian, I think, actually told me, maybe it was someone else, that it was $3 million that Mabel Wilton had, and the last name of Wilton, I think, is in a way revealing. I mean, is it by chance that it's Mabel Wilton W, and the daughter, played by May McVoy, has the last name of that also begins with W, not unlike, say, Lady Windermere's fan, Lady Windermere, and that, in fact, is one of many ways in which this film anticipates or resonates with Lady Windermere's fan, right? That the May McVoy character turns 18 in Three Women and 21 in Lady Windermere's fan, I think this was not by chance, right? And it's interesting when you sometimes read these biographies. I think Ian Iman's biography, he keeps on saying, Lubitsch said to May McVoy that he wanted her to play Lady Windermere, and May McVoy didn't want to play it. And Lubitsch said to her, "You're the only one who can play Lady Windermere," which is just to underscore the connection between these two films. But he sort of says, well, there were lots of other actresses, maybe not at Warner Brothers, but no, that wasn't the point. She was literally, given the way he thinks about the relationship between these two films, she was the only one who could play it. And likewise, the Pauline Frederick character in Three Women, there's photographs of her and photographs of Irene Rich, who plays Mrs. Airline in Lady Windermere's fan, that are virtually identical. I mean, in both these films, of course, the mother ends up sacrificing herself for her child, for her daughter. So, I mean, there's, one could go on, but these were the kinds of things, they're right there on the surface. I'm sure many of you saw this today, and, but the film itself had been sort of dismissed. As sort of, oh, well, Lubitsch wasn't really into this project and stuff like that. I mean, obviously he was totally into this project, right? And so I think it's a really important film that they presented today. I was really happy, and I have to say that they didn't follow my advice in one regard. I wanted this to be an evening film, and that we had an appropriate cocktail, like the Monkey Bar cocktail afterwards. Because I remember, was it up in Mabel's room? There was a cocktail afterwards, and for me, that was like the best evening screening in a long time. But they did, in fact, of course, end up putting a photograph from Three Women on the poster this year. So it gave them a kind of visual. So I mean, I could continue, I guess, but why don't I stop there and we can move it on to other people?
Yeah, sure. Are there already any question and or comment from the audience? Okay. Yes, there's a couple. Thank you.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll leave it to you.
I'm just curious, does the book deal with the later political triptych, i.e. communism, Ninotchka, capitalism, to be or not to be, and the film that got a lot of critical kickback, fascism, i.e. to be or not to be? Right.
Yes, it does. I mean, I would say maybe a little over half the book deals with a silent period, but a lot of the essays do deal with a sound period. And I just didn't mention them today because this is the Giornata di Cinema Muto. But yes, I mean, so you would find it, some interesting material in here. It is like a very eclectic group of essays that come at issues, from different perspectives. But, initially I thought, well, that makes it sort of random, and what does that amount to? But as I kept on reading, I realized that it was these essays individually and collectively provide a lot of food for thought in terms of thinking about Lubitsch and what he was doing.
There's another one here. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the original novel, is it also called Three Women? And if so, does it make it more obvious who the third woman is?
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I haven't read, I don't know German, so I haven't read the novel. I mean, the novel actually was turned into a film, and that film also does not exist. And it seems to me, I'm convinced that that's the kind of classic triangularization, Lubitsch. It's like an official remake of an official adaptation of the novel, but a secret remake of the film. And I really wish we had the film, and someone who's has German could pursue that. I would want to say that actually that was one thought I had about Donna, Kornhaber's emphasis on how the marriage circle was heavily influenced by a woman in Paris, is that it was based supposedly on a play, but she didn't look at the play. So so again, this is a kind of triangularization right from the go. The marriage circle, yes, okay, heavily influenced by a woman in Paris, but also an adaptation of a play. So, I mean, this is the kind of classic triangularization that I think Lubitsch does again and again in the films of this period.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charlie. So we're gonna move to another book.
One last thing, this book costs a fortune. I think it's $150 on
does.
Amazon. But like with a lot of University of Amsterdam press books, you can it's accessible online, probably at your university at the moment. But I think at a certain point it's just generally available to people of any walk in life. But that's probably the way in which it's more practical to get it. So you don't have to spend $150 to get this. I was hoping at one point maybe it could be in the donor bag, but that didn't get very far.
Thank you again. So, Jennifer, you're here to represent many people again. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for this challenging presentation, but we know your chapter is very interesting as well. So before that, can you tell us a little bit more about the book in general, very briefly, of course?
Yes, I would love to. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of my colleagues in this very rich volume. It's an honor to be talking at the Giornata. And one of the things that I want to talk about in this presentation today, and hopefully this will be helpful to many of you, is just the way that our work develops in so many different spheres and places and takes place over very long durations. So the Oxford Handbook of Silent Cinema, which is now out in both hardback and online, is 824 pages, and it has 34 chapters in it and has the work of 36 scholars in it. So it was a huge undertaking for Rob King and Charlie Keil, and they were phenomenal editors, and I just want to thank them if they're out there in the
For sure.
yeah, for the work that they did to bring this volume together. I'm just going to summarize from my notes here what the works in the book represent, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So it's divided into sections that cover the invention of cinema, the intermedial development of film aesthetics and genre, non-theatrical and non-commercial uses of film, the political economy of Hollywood mass culture, and then a section on film and global modernities, and silent film publics and counterpublics. And with all of those, the volume is meant to invite a rethinking of silent film history, and to do so in a way that is still very object-oriented, very film-centric, and also to invite researchers to talk about the way that their varied methodologies have reframed silent film history for them. So it was a very generous brief that each of us got to participate in this volume. And I believe my first communication with, I think, Rob King for around the question of participating in the volume came in 2014. So, and then in 2016, I think we sort of settled on a table of contents, or they did. And so, yeah, it's been a very, very long process. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my contribution to the book. And also what I'd like to do actually is frame my contribution around a kind of new thinking that working on this chapter produced for me, and has resulted in some new thinking about the work that I I've published. So I think my sort of keynote here is around the way in which we should think about research as it comes out of contexts such as the Giornata and Domitor and Women in Silent Screen and all of these sites of conversation and discourse. And then we publish them, and I think they change again. And I think, Charlie, even your comments about your 3 pieces on Lubitsch highlights that as well. You know, the work exists in print, but then it sort of continues too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And so, as we said, how many pages you said this there is?
Yeah,
now,
there's 824
so there
pages.
might be
in the
more.
volume.
So it's going to be a 2-hand more than
Right,
a
maybe
handbook.
Handbooks, multiple
Hands for sure.
Yeah, so my contribution comes in the section on non-theatrical and non-commercial uses of film. And about that, I want to say that I'm also very honored to be included in the volume for that, in that section. My work is on non-theatrical film of the silent period, and I've been working on educational film history for a long time, and have always felt that it has been treated as marginal as opposed to central. And very often when I come to the Giornata and other festivals, the San Francisco Silent Film Festival, when there are materials that are shown on the big screen, as Charlie says, so that we can see them differently and newly, I'm always so happy, and I would like to see more of that in the Giornata and in these other very important forums for stimulating our research further. So my article was called Babies and Brochures, Public Service Pamphlet Films of the U.S. Children's Bureau. And this chapter focuses on the entity that was housed in the Department of Labor that was headed by the first female head of any federal agency in the United States, Julia Lathrop, who was appointed to run this agency as a kind of child and maternity health, public health oriented government project. And during her time in that agency, she produced multiple forms of visual education, but was a huge proponent of moving image education, and was absolutely enthralled by the idea that one could gather mothers and families together and teach them about proper post-natal child care health initiatives. And so I started to do my research. You can go to the first slide here. I started to do my research and discovered that there was a quartet of films produced by the agency, made by the filmmaker Carlisle Ellis. And those films are titled Our Children, Wellborn, Best Fed Baby, and Sun Babies. So between 1919 and 1926, the agency produced these 4 films. And Our Children was the best sort of the blockbuster child health film of its day, and was exported almost immediately outside the United States to Canada, to Puerto Rico, to China, went to Shanghai, and then it went further afield in China. And it had requests were pouring in from around the world to have this film shown. And like many educational films, these were loaned for free by the agency. Prints were struck and sent out as they were affordable by the agency. But this is government film. It's made on a shoestring budget. And as I looked more closely at the records of the Children's Bureau, which are housed at the National Archives, I became engrossed by the conversations, you can go to the next slide, that exist there between Carlisle Ellis, between his editors, between the heads of the agency, and between the medical advisors, the public health nurses who worked at the agency. And this conversation is extensive. It is women-centered. It is a conversation about how one learns from film, but it also importantly becomes a question and a conversation about how you translate government information into moving image. And so this slide has some documents, sort of examples of documents from Carlisle Ellis back and forth between the agency. I can't even tell you what the number of documents there are in this collection, but it is a massive collection. And there's been lots of scholarly attention to the Children's Bureau, thinking about questions of 1920s child health issues, maternity care, women's suffrage, and the relationship between that political agency and that government group, but not very much about the films. So I sought a little bit more detail around how the films were doing the work of translating what was handed out for free by the government. And you can go to the next slide here. And featured in Our Children, importantly, are many of the publications of the Children's Bureau, and this sort of became the central focus for me of this chapter that is in the handbook, which is, what is this relationship between the documents that are shown on screen and the information that is narrativized in the largely documentary but somewhat narrative account of a child health conference that is held in Gadsden, Alabama. This is a film you could think of as a documentary, but it also is principally reenactment, or something that comes close to documentary reenactment, in that it is actual footage of a child health conference in Gadsden, Alabama, but it is also clearly presented in ways that make sense cinematographically, right? So I got sort of interested in this question, and it's had me thinking a lot about documents in cinema in general, and what we think about paper and the relationship between readership and spectatorship, viewership, and the way that one might perhaps be didactically spoken to about the information in a film. And we can go to the next slide here. And I just want to say the image on the right side of the screen here is the actual pamphlet an actual pamphlet from the government that is featured in the film. And the image on the other side of the screen here is a frame from the film, but it's also an image of the version of the film that exists at I, and that I looked at and examined with Elif Rangan a year and a half ago now, and Matthias Smith also was absolutely helpful in looking closely at this film and comparing it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the iPrint and the National Archives print in a little bit. And then you can see in the next, if you go to the next one, it's a beautiful projection print, tinted and toned. And I can't wait to see it on the big screen, which I have seen once at Orphans, but I do want to see it again. I hope everyone gets a chance to see it. So this is how the film concludes, by featuring a beautiful white baby and an image of a sign in Gadsden proclaiming that we should have a safe place. Babies should be happy and healthy and safe, right? And I would say that sort of was where I ended up with this film when I submitted my final version for the handbook to Charlie and to Rob. And but something kept sort of nagging at me about this film. It didn't quite make sense. I had not seen this colorful projection print when I wrote the article. All I had seen was the reference copy that exists at the National Archives. And so inspecting, as it happens, I mean, so often as it happens, when you see a different version of the film, another sort of, you get another sort of way of thinking about what this film potentially involves and what it potentially says. And before we go to this very short comparison clip, I just want to say that, this question about what this film says was completely unclear to me because of the way that the print that is at National Archives is edited. It just actually doesn't make sense. It's a kind of a Frankenstein version of the film, but I took it to be a true version of the film. I didn't have any other, I had dodgers and continuity from the records of the U.S. Children's Bureau, but they were not that helpful in understanding that particular print. I think I see Bryony out there. Yeah, so there's a negative at the BFI that I haven't looked at yet. Yeah, we have to talk. So there may be yet another version of this kind of unspooling of the mystery of how we weigh and measure this particular film. But if you go to the next, you maybe take me to the clip, and I can talk a little bit about this. So one of the things about this film is that our children, and I hope I'm okay on time.
Yes.
One of the things about this film is that it involves a largely white group of women and nurses and children and Gadsden participants who are very celebrated in the film and are shown actively involving themselves in the pageantry of this filmmaking. But there is a passage of the film that focuses on the Black families and women and children in particular in Gadsden. And this is the component of the film that just didn't make sense to me in the print that I saw at NARA. When I looked at the version, wow, I had a completely different understanding of what this film meant. And it caused me to go back and do a kind of reframe around a eugenics message for this film. And by that, I just mean that this film's relationship to the legislation that the film was advocating for around child health was a type of legislation that allowed for the licensing of midwives. And what I didn't quite understand contextually about this film was that at that time, one of the struggles between the sort of white medical establishment and Black communities was the struggle over birthing practices. And in Alabama, Black granny midwives were thought of as the sort of authority on traditional home birthing practices. And the white medical public health leadership and medical authorities were expressing a lot of concern about the continuation of this and thought that it was adding to infant mortality, which in fact is told at the beginning of the film as the main impetus for this film. Babies are dying, we must save them, right? And so in this film is a message quite direct if you understand that context, but actually quite indirect because it is not spoken in any kind of intertitle. But let's turn to the film here, and I'll just let you watch the comparison. What I'd like you to focus on two things then, and one of them is so on the right side of your screen, you're seeing the print from I, and on the left side of the film, you're seeing the National Archives version, and I've somewhat synced them up, but you can see they're edited quite differently, and one of them includes material that isn't in the other, and vice versa, actually. And here you see the handling of the brochure, which, as I've said, has caught my attention initially. And I'll also say here that Andrew Simpson did a gorgeous accompaniment of the film at Orphans this past year. So the order in which the children are handled in the National Archives print is different from the order in which they are handled in the I print. And the I print is from 1921. And the National Archives print is from 1919. There you go. So you can go back and show the next slide. Okay, if you want to change. So here are some postcard images of Gadsden, and those falls are prominently featured at the end of the film. I want to say also that these are images of Gadsden, which is in Etowah County in Alabama, which is territory of the Creek and Cherokee nations. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see images that I've started to look at of midwives from that period and their notation, because their notation of home births, and which are hard to find and archived in sort of family archives, if they're archived at all. But the reason that I've started to look at that is because another sort of ostensible reason for this film is to suggest to families and to women the importance of birth certification. And this becomes a central struggle at this moment around home birthing versus hospital births. And so, you know, the film is very complicated, I think, around these questions of birthright and authority and the acknowledgement of citizenship and residency. And maybe just go to my last slide and I'll finish up here. Yeah, so I think I'm left with a lot of questions, and I think, you know, I have more work to do. I hope to get to the BFI and see that negative if I can. And this isn't to say that, you know, we do know that these films, there are multiple copies of these types of films and recuts, and, you know, perhaps the 1921 version is actually the authoritative version from 1919, and the version that's at National Archives was a print that was struck when it was accessioned, when that collection was accessioned in 1938. You know, these are all questions that I'm left with and didn't make it into the handbook. And yet I want to encourage you to buy the handbook and read it and use it. But thank you for listening to this. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
We have time for one quick either comment or question, if there is. Well, I do have one, a very brief one.
Okay.
The colors are gorgeous.
Yeah.
So the question is, first of all, if there is any difference in colors between the copies, and it seems like this was, you were mentioning, you know, budget-wise, but for this kind of coloring and multiple colors, it means there was like a real effort to make a good movie.
And I think that is one of the questions about this particular print, which I'm led to believe came into the collection. Elif wasn't exactly sure when it arrived, and we're not sure if that can was ever even opened and shown. But that projection print is pretty pristine. And what I'm thinking was that it's 1921 when this film is struck, when this print is struck, sorry. And it's very possible that this film, having been such a successful US film in 1919, was taken into sort of post-war charity organizations. I mean, I can imagine this being a kind of film that can get slid into a Red Cross worker's bag and is taken to some site in Europe. And the intention there is to show it as part of a program in a kind
Like
of
help, international
post-war
help.
humanitarian aid context for showing the film, and perhaps never actually shown, and thus somehow then made it into the hands of a collector and then to yeah. And but I'd never seen any of the Bureau's films in this form as a projection print, and it was quite astonishing for me to view that as a researcher.
It is.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you for the
again,
question.
Jennifer.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna move to the last book. Quickly. Here we go.
Yeah.
So, Geoff, thank you very much for being with us tonight. And this book is in the donor bag, so we're very pleased and happy about it. And also, it is. You should have a copy here.
402 pages.
Yeah.
Ugh.
It's easier than the other. These other two are definitely heavier, so they're more portable. We are thinking of your back. That's why we choose something lighter. And we're very happy, of course, with John Libbey, which we much appreciate. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, the book started 10 years ago when I joined a group of people who were funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which has government money to give to suitable research projects. And they gave money for a 4-year study of the British transition to sound. So if there's anyone who has difficulties accessing the National Health Service, one of the reasons why is that you are funding me and some other people on this insignificant project. But it's not insignificant because Britain, in the European context, was a pioneer in developing talking features. They didn't remain the pioneer for very long, but we were first for a few months. And also we had the distinction among other countries in Europe and beyond, apart from America, that our films were in English. And that gave the producers in Britain the rather false hope, as it turned out, that their product, speaking in English, would immediately have a gateway into the American distribution system and maybe even challenge Hollywood's position as the center of the world, partly also because of the geographical position of London on the globe. You've got America over there, then you've got the British Isles and London, and you've got Europe on the other side, and it was felt that we were in a perfect position to change the whole history of cinema and make it centered on London. These were absurd, naive hopes that didn't come about, but it's been a fascinating process to follow what happened, especially since I was doing it in a 10-year period in which the digitization of trade papers and periodicals went on apace. And so at the beginning of it, I was studying the hard copies in various libraries, the British Film Institute and the British Library. And then increasingly, I could get much more forensic detail and train my research in a more focused way through the digitization of newspapers. So I'm extremely grateful to David Pearce and all he played a part in that, and all the other people who have not just benefited me, but lots of other historians as well. It's 402 pages, which gave me enough scope to not just deal with the feature film production, but also towards the end to have a look at newsreels, documentaries, experimental and amateur films. It also gave me room to have a 14-page index, which is very helpful. This is the first book to be entirely devoted to the British sound transition. And I know I'm an interested party here, but it would seem like a book that was very well worth reviewing. You know, online, in print, social media, anything at all. It's on sale at the in the book fair part of the Verdi at a reduced price. I think it's £35 it usually sells now. In Britain, I think it's about 40 or 42 euros, but there's a reduced price for this event. So I thought I'd have a quick tour of some of the parts of the book that deal more with the silent part of the period than the talkie part. And could we have the next slide, please? And the earliest event that I deal with comes from 1878, when the inventor and anarchist philosopher Wordsworth Donisthorpe, wonderful name, he sent a letter to the British magazine Nature, published under the heading Talking Photographs. What he's describing here is actually a theory that he had. He wasn't talking about a fact that he'd experienced, but it's still significant because he was imagining a way of taking the sequential images, in this case of the British Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, making a speech, which he photographed him doing this with his kinesigraph camera. And he thought, wouldn't it be great if we linked that with the sound of the same speech recorded on one of Edison's newfangled cylinders? He pursued this no further, but there it was. He had the idea, and even in the second paragraph of that letter, you'll even find the prophetic phrase, talking picture. He was thinking about a photograph picture, but even so, there it is, the phrase. Now, the next slide, please. Now we go on the left, the top left, to 1900. By this time, silent films projected with very roughly synchronized sound on cylinders or discs were becoming a commercial reality. On the top left, there's a frame from what the BFI calls the earliest surviving British sound film. And it features the American-born musical performer and pantomime performer Lil Hawthorne. And she's singing a song, Kitty Mahone, on the roof of the recently built London Hippodrome Theatre, which was owned by the showman Walter Gibbons, who had this novelty now called phono bio tableau. At the bottom right, we have something that turned out to be much more significant in terms of the history of sound, not just in Britain. There is, in the center, you get the French-born inventor Eugène Laust. He's standing in his back garden in South London, in Brixton, South London, and he's filming and recording a vocal performance in an early example of optical sound, with sound and images registered on the same strip of celluloid. And he was able to apply in London for a patent for this process in 1906. So this comes after that, but it's probably in towards the 1910 period. Now, the next slide, please. We're jumping over various processes called the chronophone, the vivaphone, and other disc-based novelties of the time, which usually end in phones. And we're in the 1920s now. And optical sound, by this point, has become more widely used and developed. And up on the top left, you find the maverick figure of Harry Grindle Matthews. He's the guy with the outstretched hand pointing towards the performers. And he became notorious in 1924, but this is 3 years before that, he became notorious for inventing an electronic beam, which was popularly known as the death ray, which was supposedly capable of stopping motorcycles and distantly igniting gunpowder and killing laboratory rats and possibly starting World War II early. The players there, they are all performers from a stage extravaganza, which had a scene where they adopted historical costume, and they were perched for this on the roof of his own studio near Oxford Circus, but they were perfectly safe there because he hadn't invented the beam yet. We're not sure if that was actually publicly exhibited. I think possibly it was an item in a newsreel, which might not have had sound at that time. Anyway, the bottom picture, very fuzzy. It looks an awful film, and in some ways it is, but it's an important one. It's 1925. It's a dramatic sketch called The Gentleman. It was made by the British offshoot of Lee de Forest's Phonofilm Company, and it was seemingly the first of the British crop of films to be publicly exhibited. And its director, William J. Elliott, later claimed it as, this is a quote, the first modern soundtrack photographed on film talkie play, shown to any public in the world. Well, that's not true at all, because de Forest's American phonofilm product made its public debut 2 years earlier. Nevertheless, the British phonofilm output, and there's about 200, I think, short films, and the BFI archive, luckily, hold about 80 of them. They played a significant part in preparing the public for the introduction of regular entertainment featuring optical sound. The phonofilm speciality, however, wasn't dramatic sketches like that one, or even comic sketches. It was performance films. And here we move to the next slide, please. Performance films where musical and variety singers and comedians stood before a static camera. They opened their mouths, as you can see, and let loose with songs and comic patter. On the top left, you've got the Yorkshire comedian Dick Henderson. Top right, you've got the visiting American singer Dick Robertson. Don't get them confused. The bottom left, you have the radio and variety performer Leslie Saroni, who's singing Don't Be Cruel to a Vegetable. Bottom right, he's not a radio and variety performer, but he is the playwright George Bernard Shaw. And he had been the star attraction of the Phonofilm's chief rival, Fox Movietone, which had first been showcased in London in 1927. And audiences, when they saw this film, were stunned because they not only heard Shaw's Irish whimsy and charm, they also heard birds singing in the background and, quite exciting, the crunch of his foot on the gravel of his garden path, which he was walking along. And the film survives. You can see it on YouTube, in other places. And the synchronization is actually extremely good. The next slide, please. Now the big milestone in Britain's British sound transition. This is a picture taken by a press photographer during the first afternoon shooting on the 10th of April, 1929, of the talkie version of Hitchcock's thriller Blackmail. Hitchcock is that slightly pear-shaped figure with his back to us, instructing the players in a set that represents an office at Scotland Yard. You can see the microphone just about visible above Hitchcock's head there. The bulky construction in the front is that is where the camera and the cameraman lived. The sound recording booth is up on the right. Now, Hitchcock, from press accounts, we know that he was suffering from a cold on this day, and when the actual shooting was in progress, he had to retreat into the camera booth where he could observe the shooting without disrupting the recording with his coughs and sneezes. In the same spirit, the male players, you see some of them at the back, John Longdon, and I forget for the moment the name of the other guy, they were wearing their own clothes. And they were instructed to remove all coins and keys, anything that could jangle, from their pockets in case they accidentally jangled while they were speaking their dialogue. Not for nothing was the microphone often known as King Mike. And he was a king with absolute power because he upended the long-established film practices, changing the ways that studios were constructed and fitted, the way films were shot and edited, and the materials used in set construction and costume design, because some costumes made a lot of noise as they worked. Some materials used in sets weren't very good at absorbing sound, others were better. The sound invasion also changed some of the performers' voices. Could we have the next slide? And here's the way that one British cartoonist in April 1929 depicted the process, called at the time voice doubling, not dubbing, doubling. Here, the singing voices of physically attractive young lovebirds, he imagined them being replaced on the soundtrack by the voices of people not so young or attractive who could really sing. Now, this cartoon was in response to voice doubling in American imports. That month alone, April 1929, had brought the Universal film of Showboat to London, with Laura LaPlante, not known for singing, suddenly able to wow audiences singing Old Man River and Can't Help Loving That Man. Now, blackmail had its own doubling phenomenon when the voice, the Czech voice of Annie Ondra was replaced by a very ladylike English voice of Joan Barry, who was a theatre actress. She had done some earlier silent film work. But this ladylike voice of Joan Barry was not in itself a perfect fit for the role that Ondra played, which was the daughter of a London newsagent. Now, can we have slide 8, please? A lot of this vocal surgery went on in Britain in 1929, especially at British International Pictures, which was the company that spearheaded the sound invasion in features in Britain, and they were the producer of Blackmail. And the most damaging operation I know was performed on Arthur Robison's The Informer, adapted from the novel, which was later filmed by John Ford in Hollywood. That version is quite well known. This one is not. It was made as a silent, and then it was converted into a part talkie with new dialogue scenes added. Now, the setting was Ireland. The characters were Irish. The trouble was the two leading players were played by foreign actors who couldn't speak convincing English, let alone master an Irish accent. Something indeed barely attempted by any of the cast. The Swedish Lars Hansen, who played the hunted gang informer Gippo Nolan, was given the rotund bass voice of R.E. Jeffrey, who was a former BBC radio producer who is now on the studio staff. The Hungarian Lea Depucci, playing his sweetheart Katie, now spoke with the dulcet tones of Patricia Hayes, who was much later a familiar character actress in British films and television, but at the time was a 19-year-old drama school graduate. In the process, as you will see from this clip we're going to show, a visually striking silent film was pretty much ruined, and it got the sound version got very bad reviews. Now, this clip is from a scene late in the film when Gippo, the Irish Republican paramilitary turned informer, has been shot by his former comrades, and he crawls through Katie's bedroom window. And may we run the clip, please?
Oh, Chippo, what's he done? Sleep, Chippo. You're safe here with me.
Katie, it's no use. They won't rest till they get me for good. What are you doing, Katie? Where are you going?
I'm going to the police. You did it for them, and they must give you protection.
I don't want it. I don't want it.
Yes, I'll go. It'll be all right, Chippo. Sleep till I come back.
Oh, God. Now you can understand why the Giannotti is probably never going to screen the sound version of The Informer. The silent version is extremely good. Now, I have one more clip to show you as a kind of a supplement to the Anna May Wong film showing this week. And it's a clip from The Flame of Love, which was made at the end of 1929, where Anna plays a Chinese dancer in Imperial Russia just before World War I. Now, earlier in 1929, she had been seen on stage in London in a production of the Chinese play The Circle of Chalk, which was later an inspiration for Bertolt Brecht's The Caucasian Chalk Circle. Critics uncomfortably noticed that May had a rather low registered speaking voice, which her physical form didn't really suggest. Also, she spoke with an American accent, which didn't help playing a Chinese character. They also noticed that she couldn't really sing, although her role did involve some singing. Apparently, she had 4 notes in the scale of 8 notes that she could deliver some kind of slightly steady tone on. Now, in The Flame of Love, she's worked on her accent. That's less noticeable, but the voice is still quite low. But as for the singing, well, if we see the next clip, please, you will hear quite a transformation.
Yes.
Oops, no, that's a slide before. That's it.
cherries are blooming. Love will come to
Can we have the last slide, please? Well, critics at the time, the film critics said, Anna May Wong has a really good singing voice. Well, she didn't fool me, I can tell you. But I would end this little spin through the book with a memento of another aspect of the upheaval in Britain caused by the transition to sound. It's the arrival of the filmed play containing talk, 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 and talk. Now that image documents the day in 1930 when the very respected author John Galsworthy was someone who took his plays very seriously. He visited the shooting of his play Escape. He's sitting between the stage actress, or stage and film actress Edna Best on the left, and the distinguished stage actor Sir Gerald du Maurier, who plays the main part in the film. And then you see the enormous microphone hanging above them. It looks more like a primitive vacuum cleaner to me. Anyway, it's hanging above their heads. Now, the film of Escape isn't one of those that's imprisoned by talk. But even so, that microphone is rather oppressive. And it makes me think of a sentence that the silent British director Adrian Brunel wrote in a letter some months later in 1930. And this is the quote and the end of my little spiel. I now find it possible to enjoy a good talkie, for they have definitely improved, but nonetheless, I do regret most terribly the disappearance of the silent film. And that, I think, is something that we all feel. Thank you.
Is there a question or a wow, that was quick. So yes, couples, excellent.
Congratulations on the book, Geoff. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a much more complicated history than I think probably anybody ever understood before your book has come out. And you have unpicked it with unbelievable clarity. The astonishing thing is how many companies went bust, how many villains there were in the story, all of which I don't think anybody else probably knew about, because we were all given the simple narrative: blackmail arrived, talkies were here. And that's not the story at all in British cinema and the transition to sound. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. There were a lot of companies that went bust when sound came in, and many of them had only just been formed. And the catalyst for them being formed was the 1927 Cinematograph Films Act, which I talk quite a bit about in the book. And this came into being because the industry and the government were very concerned about American domination of the cinema exhibition scene in Britain, and therefore the lack of opportunities for British films to flourish. So they devised this act where a quota was applied for production companies to make a certain number of British films per year. But this was an act, it was enacted in 1928, and it was entirely formed on the assumption that films would be silent and would continue to be silent forevermore. There was no indication in any of the many provisions of the act that sound, which by that point in 1927 had made its appearance in American talkies with the jazz singer, no hint that this might affect the industry in Britain. So a lot of companies were formed on rather shaky financial grounds, hoping to get access to more money through the clauses of the Act and the support that the government was giving to the industry. But they were geared up towards making silent films. After 14 months, once the act had been passed, Blackmail was in production as a talkie. The other major, more established companies who hadn't suddenly developed because of the act, they were starting to convert their studios to make talkies, and all these little companies, which were incompetently managed and hadn't the wherewithal to make talkies, most of them just went foot, and they were with the liquidators certainly by 1930, and in some cases before that. The major companies survived actually quite well. British International Pictures, British and Dominion, several others, although they had a big drop in profits in the early 30s, mainly because they had all these silent films that they'd been visibly making, and they were hung around their necks because they couldn't distribute them except by the awful process of the part talkie process. But they survived quite well. You mentioned villains. I've got a couple in the book who were shady characters. This was another aspect of the quick promotion of film companies, that quite a few of them, well, quite a few, I can't count the actual number, but there were a couple of real operators who made fraudulent claims and tried to get public support for companies that really weren't going to produce anything at all. And I talk about some of them in the book. They're colorful characters that can add spice to the narrative. So they're heroes and villains, and it's human nature. It's a human story. It's not just a story of technology and the advance of that and the disruption it causes. It's a story of human ambition and human folly and human courage and human cowardice. It's all there. It's all there.
Thank you. There was a last question, I think, over there.
Yeah, so I know definitely in Hollywood early on in the transition to sound, there was some films where they would shoot an English version in the day and then, a Spanish or a different language like Dracula at night. Was that a practice that was pretty common in Britain too, with different European languages? And if so, how long did that last and how successful commercially was that?
It didn't last very long. It was first thought this was the way to solve the great problem that talkies had brought to the world sales for films. But it was a very cumbersome, time-consuming process. BIP, the Blackmail studio, they started off the process in the summer of 1929 by making Atlantic, a film really about the Titanic sinking. And they made it with a German director, famous German director, E.A. Dupont. And it was decided to make it in two versions, English and German, with the cast going through the motions on set in English, and then the same cast coming in to the same set and doing the same scene in German. They also decided once the German film had come out, it actually came out before the English version, and it was a great success in Germany. They thought, okay, maybe we better also make a French version, which they did later, but in a patchwork fashion, where they inserted French language scenes into the more spectacular scenes from the English version, which didn't have dialogue. But by 1932-33, there were other ways of dealing with it. Subtitling was a problem. It was okay for some audiences, but not with others. But that was attempted. Dubbing and some voice doubling of entire movies, that was done, especially in Germany. But by 1932, 1933, that had mostly died away, although Germany continued to make multilingual versions, not with England. England dropped out once Hitler came in. I mean, I'm being rather caricatured here. It's much more complex than that. But France continued to make co-productions with Germany until about 1938, when they had enough of the process. But dubbing came in, the editing of sound got much easier. The technology developed so that dubbing a film with the voices of foreign actors could be done in a much more sensible way. So it didn't last for very long.
There was a last question over there.
How long did it take the theaters to install sound equipment? Do you have any sense of the pace in England versus the United States?
That's a good question, because it wasn't instantaneous at all. At first, it was only the major cinemas in London that got the technology, which was mostly American. It was mostly Western electric. Then it started to spread to the outer regions, but that still left, parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland and the more hinterland places without a functioning sound cinema for quite a few years. And the market developed in actually making the rather desperate silent films up until, I think, the autumn of 1931. And these are all very impoverished melodramas made by young people who are coming into the industry. And we're just glad of the chance to make a film, even though it was pretty poor stuff. And there are, I can't quote you the actual figures, but they are in the book, of the number of wired cinemas, and it gradually got more and more, and the silent cinemas got fewer and fewer. The very last silent cinema that ran just silent films, I think that closed in 1936 or 7. Supposedly it was the last one. And that was a straggler, really, because most of the silent cinemas had eventually converted to sound by 1935, 4 or 5. But it wasn't immediate, of course, because the different cinemas have their own problems with the size of the hall or their clientele, or they didn't have the resources, financial resources, to buy into the new sound technology. And some were diehards and thought, silent film cannot die, we must keep on playing silent films. But the demise of the cinema just showing silent features was inevitable. It just took longer time than you might think.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Geoff, for this beautiful presentation on the book. So I want to thank all of our authors and also you for participating, and invite you for tomorrow for our last book presentation. Thank you again. See you tomorrow.